Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have so many people here in person, and I know there are a lot of people watching the live stream as well. I'm Eve Stern, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and I'm so excited for the first event in our year-long series on innovations in storytelling. It's a real pleasure and honor to have Dr. B. Erin Cole joining us today. And she, earlier this afternoon, did a wonderful workshop on careers in public history for our history majors, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say tonight, this afternoon. After the talk, we'll have questions and answers, and then Dr. Cole will be selling their comics at the back of the room. So if you're interested in buying some really cool comics, stick around for that, and coffee and lemonade and cookies. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Eric Loomis, a professor of history, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you all for coming here on a lovely Wednesday afternoon. I was telling Erin the weather's always like this in Rhode Island. I want to thank my colleagues at the Center for Humanities who helped Eve and I put this thing together this year. We have a lot of awesome talks coming up over the fall and the spring. Eve's going to kind of close by talking just a little bit about that. But I'm here today to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Erin Cole. Erin and I I've known Erin for like 20 years now, which is insane. But it turns out I'm old. I thought it was just the baldness, but now it's general oldness. If I could see through my, probably need trifocals now. Erin and I have went to the University of New Mexico where we did our PhD, the University of New Mexico is not considered Yale or Harvard or Stanford. And what this meant functionally was that while people who went to Yale and Harvard and Stanford were all on long-term fellowships and didn't have to hustle while they were in graduate school, our assistantships were only 3 years, and so we had to hustle like crazy. And what this meant is that even as the history job market kind of collapsed after 2008, most of us ended up getting really good jobs because we had more skills than the Yale and Harvard and Stanford people. And this was maybe there's a story to tell, maybe there's a lesson to tell in that, and maybe there's not. But the point is that we had a lot of help and advisement to kind of do what we wanted as historians, and to not necessarily go down traditional tracks. And that's what's what I've done, even though I'm here, but I do a lot of other weird things. And it's what a lot of our colleagues have done, and it certainly is what Erin did. So Erin became a museum developer, was the assistant state historian in Colorado, and has put together all kinds of cool exhibits on the environmental history of Colorado, on Chicano history, on the First Avenue Music Club in Minneapolis. So not your boring exhibits, but the ones that you actually want to attend. And also is a really well-known comic artist. And so everybody thinks history is totally boring and like these books are so lame, and maybe that's true. Erin has sort of discovered other ways to tell stories about history. And back in 2019, we were on a trip to a conference in Las Vegas, and we sat next to each other on a lovely tour of the Nevada test site, which is where we blew up all of our nuclear bombs. It was a really weird time, and Erin and I stood next to a nuclear blast crater, which you can't say about all of your friends, but I was sitting there, and Erin just starts like sketching stuff. The crazy thing our tour guide, who was like, I still wish we were testing nuclear bombs, was saying, and like all the questions the historians were asking, and all the really screwed up stuff that we saw. And 4 years later, Erin is like drawn all this amazing cartoons about our nuclear heritage in the American West, which, if you are from the American West, is a big part of your life. And yeah, so that's enough of me, and I'm going to introduce the great Erin Cole to you. So thank you.
All right, I have the fancy mic. Hello, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Hopefully, does this one have to go off too? I don't want to be double mic'd here. I'm going to push whatever that is. Right. There we go. That's
That's really efficient. So thank you, Eric. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out to hear me talk about comics and history and the ways that those things go together sometimes. So before I start talking, I would like to thank the University of Rhode Island Center for the Humanities for bringing me out. Thank Evelyn Stern, her assistant Laura Stifler for helping with all of the arrangements for bringing me from Colorado, and my friend Eric Loomis for coming up with the idea of me coming out here to begin with. So they did a great job and were wonderful to work with. So today, again, I'm doing a talk called Cute Drawings of Terrible Things. And the talk title actually comes from, so I do a lot of tabling at comics events, and people like pick up my stuff and they have no idea who I am or what I'm doing. And a couple of comic fests ago, somebody was like, "I'd like your stuff and it's cute, but it's about everything terrible." So, so that's kind of the contradictions at the base of my work. I draw very cute, but I also draw things about things like brain injury and atomic weapons and cute blobs in very awkward situations. So, so here I am again. I'm a historian, a museum professional, a cartoonist. This is my pre-pandemic here. Um, so I realized when I sent this picture off, I'm like, I don't really look like this anymore. Here's my website and my social media accounts, and I will repeat this again at the end, so you'll be able to look at those. And here's a little roadmap of where we're going with this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do, specifically the comics that I've been drawing for the last 4 or 5 years. I'm going to talk about my origin story. All comics have good origin stories. I'm going to talk about my origin story as a cartoonist. I'm going to detour a little bit to talk about graphic history itself, give you some examples of how comics people and historians working with comics people have created really compelling ways to talk about the past. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my process, how I draw comics, some of the questions that I come up with when I'm actually drawing about things, and then will be time for Q&A. So the comics that I draw are mostly online, although I will have some of them for sale in the back. So this actually QR code will take you to a website that actually has all my comics on it, and will have links to a lot of the books I'm talking about. And again, this will be at the end as well. So, but this is how you can find my work after our talk. All right. So what do I do? That's a really good question, and I ask myself this all the time. So hold on, like my screen just scrolled up a whole bunch. So first off, I want to introduce you to this character. This is a character called Little Brain. So this is me, actually, in pink blob form. You know, we all have our internal pink blobs. That's mine. And Little Brain is a character that I created about 7 years ago after I had a traumatic brain injury. And I use comics to actually talk to people, communicate about what my brain injury was like. So every cartoonist dreams of creating an iconic character. I don't know if I have, but that's Little Brain. And you'll see Little Brain through a lot of the pictures in here. So this is me. So I draw comics on a couple of different topics. I draw about history and museums, and that's what we're going to focus on today. But I want to let you know that I also draw about brains and mental health a lot. So if you actually follow my Instagram and other things, there'll be a lot of things about mental health and self-care and things like that. But I also draw a lot of cute things that are just kind of in weird situations. So, but we're not going to talk about those comics today. But I do a lot of things that are kind of more family friendly, less depressing than nuclear weapons and brain injuries. So let's focus on history comics. So I draw 2 different types of history comics, and I'm going to talk about both of those today. The first one I draw is actually more of a meta commentary on being a historian. So I don't necessarily draw here's what happened and this happened next. It's more like, what is being a historian like? How do historians think about the past? How do historians look at things and get annoyed at how badly these stories are told? What is it like to deal with the problem of bad interpretation and things like that? So a lot of my comics are actually about that, and I'll go through a few of them. But I've started to actually work more in a whatever a traditional graphic history sense is, actually kind of relating history is the history of places as well as talking about kind of reflecting on my thoughts about them. So in my day job, the one that pays well, let me tell you, comics don't pay very well. I'm just going to be upfront about that. So I actually make museum exhibits as my actual thing that pays the rent. So, and I'll talk a little bit how I got into that and how that actually like affects, influences the way I draw. But the first history themed comic I ever did was this one for an online site called Contingent. And it's basically about the exhibit development process and how I used to be a historian and now I just make exhibits. And this is really kind of a snarky, like, kind of view of the overall exhibit development process. Like, I used to do all this stuff, but now I write these little tiny blurbs for people who I don't know are going to read it. So, so this is the first thing I did. If you have ever made exhibits, this is probably your favorite panel. So about the corner of awkward exhibit team compromises, and then like a donor insisted. So this got a lot of really positive attention, and I still get things. This gets assigned in like museum studies courses all the time. So, so this is a comic called "The Desert Keeps Receipts," which is what Eric was talking about. This is a comic about my trip to the Nevada test site, along on this bus of snark, this bus full of cynicism. As you know, it recounts my feelings going through this complex landscape that's extremely beautiful but extremely troubling, and kind of the separation between what our guide is telling us. Again, he's just like, nuclear testing is great, and but seeing the actual sadness of that landscape. So this was kind of one of the first times I'm really like trying to think about, you know, kind of this story of the atomic West. And then I also did at the same time I did this comic called "Am I Still a Historian?" unquote. And this is about kind of my journey as being a public historian, going from academic history into public history, into museums, into comics, and wondering if I'm actually still a historian. And the answer is yes, I am. I'm not, but just this thing about this kind of, it's almost like a meditation on the grief of like letting one thing go and getting to another place, but you're not quite sure what's going to happen at the end. So this is talking about like, you know, I have a PhD in history. I work for a history museum. I know how bad things can get. So of course I'm a historian, but that doesn't mean you're always like recognized as one. Again, I don't have a book. I don't have tenure, things like that. So this was kind of a really, really personal kind of comic about my feelings about this. And there's a lot of people in the field who have these feelings. They're like, they tell me I should do this, but I'm actually doing that. And how do I merge those things? So, and it's okay to laugh at what you're reading. So don't feel bad. So, um, so let me tell you a little bit about my current project. So, and then we'll get into a question of how I got there. So as Eric mentioned, if you grew up in the American West, the kind of atomic and nuclear history is a big part of the landscapes around you. And I grew up in kind of like an atomic family. I had family who were like uranium miners. Many of them died of silicosis before I was even born. My dad worked for the Atomic Energy Commission. He is a geologist. And then my hometown was basically both the Manhattan Project's uranium procurement site, and then it became a site of uranium milling from the 50s to the 70s, and that has left a huge toxic legacy in the town. So, like, my middle school was built on uranium mill tailings. So they took them out while we were all going to school there because why close the school down? So my current project is kind of a memoir about growing up in this kind of landscape and talking about the actual history of atomic Colorado, from mining to milling to testing to weapons production and then to quote unquote cleanup and how we tell those stories today. So I'm looking at 4 different places around the state. Yerevan is mining. Grand Junction, my hometown, is about processing. Rulison and Rio Blanco are about nuclear testing, and I'll have a little bit more to share about how messed up that is. And then Rocky Flats is weapons production and kind of the anti-nuclear movement. So that's actually where I'm going with the work I'm doing. So originally, when I started working on this bigger project, I wanted to do something where I had a series of comics very similar to the one I did at the Nevada test site, where I go to nuclear sites and talk about how badly interpreted they are, because they're all badly interpreted. I'm just going to point that out. And they're all kind of badly interpreted in the same way. So this is kind of one of the comics that was a genesis for this project, and it's a comic called How to Visit Rocky Flats in 20 Confusing Steps. Rocky Flats, again, was a nuclear weapons facility. They made plutonium pits for nuclear weapons. It's right outside of Denver, which is a terrible place to put a nuclear weapons facility that close to a major city. And it had almost had a couple of meltdowns during its history. And it released a lot of radiation into the Denver metro area. I know. Like, nothing, everything's, all through nuclear history is good times. So, anyway, so that's what I was going to do. So it's going to do a series of this, but it turns out, again, they're all badly interpreted in the same way. And there's only so many ways I can draw myself frowning in an interpretive panel. So that was kind of the end of that idea. And then when I actually talk about atomic history to people at home or they don't actually know what happened. They don't really know a lot about these stories. I mean, there's been a little bit more buzz lately with the Oppenheimer movie coming out, but a lot of people don't know this history, especially how it affects our landscapes and bodies and things like that. So I switched to this other project, and this is actually something I was hoping to have done for this talk, so that I could share like actual color images with you, but it's taking forever. So I'm actually kind of testing out this project with a comic about Project Plowshare in Colorado. And Project Plowshare is a terrible idea. I'm just going to be so Project Plowshare was this initiative by the Atomic Energy Commission from like the mid 50s to the mid 70s to use nuclear weapons for peaceful uses. Basically, and by that they mean like, what if we nuked ourselves a new Panama Canal? What if we nuked a harbor in Alaska? There's some mountains in the way of this railroad. What if we just remove them with nuclear weapons? So they're not really peaceful. And a lot of those, none of those things happened, thank God. But what did happen is in Colorado and New Mexico, they did a series of underground tests to see if nuclear weapons could help free up natural gas. So it's basically fracking with an atomic bomb. And I can tell you, first off, is yes, a nuclear weapon will release a lot of natural gas, but it will be radioactive. And you need to cap it and keep it in the ground forever. So it is kind of a big womp womp of Colorado history. So that's what I'm working on right now. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about my origin story, and then I'm going to talk about like process and things like that. So I actually wanted to be a cartoonist, like from an early time period. Like when I was a kid, my parents got both the big Denver papers, they got the local paper, and they all had huge cartoon sections. And I mean, those of you who were too young to like have a big packet of news delivered to your house every day, like if you're a kid, you're like, look at all these comics. So I loved comics from an early time, and I wanted to draw them. And so there's a lot of things that really like influenced my work, but so I'm going to point out a few things. One is The Far Side by Gary Larson. I have a science dad, and science dads love The Far Side. So these like one panel, simple, goofy, just like basically cartoons, but they're all based in like actually sort of some scientific knowledge. I mean, like that didn't actually happen, but let me tell you, paleontologists love that comic so much. So, but just thinking, I mean, now I can look back and see like here's some very complex kind of communication that's taking place like in a panel with like goofy looking dinosaurs. So it's actually kind of possible to do this kind of work. Another thing that really influenced me is Bloom County. So which if it was like it's basically the 80s, the Reagan administration in comics form. And when I was in middle school, I was really obsessed with this comic. Like everyone else was like doing like things like dating, and I was really obsessed with like Bloom County. And like I'm like, there's a comic in here about Casper Weinberger, and I don't know who that is. So I figured if I figured out the jokes here, I could figure out adults. And that's not actually true, but that's where we came up. That's where it started. And then I started branching out into other things, and I spent a lot of time like exploring the cartoonists of the New Yorker. And the person who's probably had the most influence on my sense of humor and way of drawing and everything is Roz Chast. So for a long time, was actually one of the few female cartoonists at the New Yorker. So um, I basically like I just kind of I'm like this is exactly the sense of humor I have in a lot of ways. But the thing that I look back when I'm actually a cartoonist, I'm like, oh, it's okay to draw these really wonky panels. It's okay to like not actually be able to quote draw, like you know things like that. So, and then when I was in high school, I got really into the work of Matt Groening. So, those of you who are younger, he's the guy who created The Simpsons. But for a long time, he had a comic called Life in Hell, which is basically about like how terrible it is to be an adult. So, but like look, these really simple drawings, like Mongo, it's just like the ugliest bunny in the world. Um, but simple drawings, lots of text, lots of arrows. I love to draw arrows in my work, and this is exactly where that came from. So that's like there's all of this stuff that I can now look back and see this in my own work. And then during the '90s, when I was into my 20s, um, I got really into independent comics, the things published by like Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly. And me and a lot of my comics friends all drew like really terrible comic scenes and photocopied them and traded them with one another. So I was just kind of like, even though I was like, doing all these other things, comics were a really, really important part of my life. How I communicated and how I thought about the world. But then I stopped drawing. So somewhere out in like the late '90s, maybe early 2000s, and this is really common. There's a huge amount of attrition in the arts when people are like, I don't know how to do this. So basically, I stopped drawing for two reasons, and one's good and one's bad. The bad one is that I didn't think I was very good at it, and I thought I didn't have anything to say. And I was just like, I have no idea what I'm drawing about. I'm not very good. I would look at like some of the people that I like really admired, and I'm like, they know how to draw. And I was working on an art degree at the time, and I got a lot of feedback from my professors going like, your style has too much line. It's too cartoony. It's too liney. So I stopped drawing. But the good reason I stopped drawing is I went to grad school for history. So this is my dissertation. It lives in a box in Albuquerque. And it's also a PDF floating around the internet somewhere. So I loved graduate school. Like I actually really liked it. I love learning how to analyze texts and read and stuff like this, but grad school in history is very textual. Even though there's a lot of people who do digital history and other things, I did a program where people love words. So, um, so I learned a lot about this, how to write, how to use evidence, how to use tone, how to tell a story. But I really missed the visual part. So, so enter museums. So as Eric pointed out, I am a museum professional. I worked at History Colorado Center in Denver, and then I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, and now I'm like a freelance consultant. And when I started working in museums, I just was like a little researcher doing some research tasks. But I found how much I love bringing visuals back into history. Being able to create something that's like an immersive environment with like lighting and color and objects and things like that. And at one point, I realized like museum exhibits are just big comic strips. So, I mean, comics are sequential art. You layer text and images to move the reader's eye and their attention forward. Museum exhibits are sequential narrative environments. If they're an argument you walk through, you layer multimedia, images, artifacts, text to create kind of something that's simple and straightforward and emotionally engaging. So they're basically the same thing. At least I think so. So, but I found that in museums, people like drawing. People love, they're like, that's a cool thing that you do, which I didn't really get a lot in, not necessarily an art grad program, but in the field. So I started drawing again. And so that's, again, once again, there's a good and bad reason for everything. It's good I started drawing in for museums, but the other reason I started like really expanding what I was doing is I fell and hit my head on the ice when I lived in Minnesota. So, and again, I had the thing that was the least affected by the fall were my visual skills. I had a hard time reading for a long time. I had typing felt like I was like losing myself in the sentence, but my visual skills, my drawing skills were not very effective. And again, I'm actually pretty recovered, so don't worry too much. But I started drawing this little brain thing to kind of tell people like, here's what's going on. Here's what's going on in my brain. Here's how things are happening. And again, little brain can be a whole lot of things. He can vomit. He can be dazed. He can do other things. And so, but I also started sharing them with people who like had brain injuries, and they're just like, "Hey, your comics really helped me like show my family what was going on." So I'm like, "Huh, there may be a thing here." And so here's some other guys as a little brain. That was a sign I had on my desk for a long time at work, telling people, "No, I can't do whatever it is you're asking me to do." And then I actually found that there's actually kind of a field called graphic medicine. And we're going to transition to graphic history in a section. And basically, graphic medicine is healthcare and illness told through the medium of comics. So there's actually an organization, there's a conference, but there's a lot of people who use comics to kind of convey like their mental states or what it's like to be a patient or what it's like to be a doctor. And so I actually went that direction for a little bit and went to their conferences and stuff like this. But they were so kind of, everyone in that thing was so good at talking about like, hey, comics are great for expressing interiority. They're really great for creating your own iconography of your experience that you can use to like understand yourself better and help other people understand what you're going through. And that's why I started thinking, well, I'm a historian and I do that for other people's stories. Why not do that for some of my own stories? And that's where we started getting into all of the atomic landscapes. All right, we're going to step back from me for a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what history comics can do. Because I get this question a lot when I'm talking to like people in academia. They're like, well, what's a good history comic that I can recommend to my students? Or, I'm teaching mouse. What other things I want to, things like that. So I don't have a whole lot of recommendations, but I'm going to show you some things that I really like the history comics can do that really influenced my own work. And this is just something I created for an AHA thing about like how history and comics might work together. Look how excited comics are. Look how cranky history is. What about my footnotes? All right, so this is an image from Battle Lines, which is a graphic history of the Civil War, written by historian R.A. Kelman and illustrated by Jonathan Fettervorm. And what comics can do is they can really get to the heart of what's going on. Something that might be really complex in written form can be so simple in graphic form. So this is the panel that explains the Civil War, why it happened. All of these things, all of these laws, all these decisions rested on this very, very uneasy, like, foundation of slavery and liberty. Like, you don't even need to read those words to know what this is telling you. So that's a really effective panel. This is from a graphic memoir by Miriam Katim, this is about her and her mother's like attempts to flee Germany during the rise of Nazism. But I like this just looking at the way that the image moves across the page. You start up here with the Hebrew letters really focused, and then it goes out to like her and her mother. But then in kind of like a very parallel kind of arrangement here, you see like kind of like this light being replaced with darkness. The darkness of the swastika and Nazism. Like, you don't need words to know what's happening in there. So this is from kind of a middle grade graphic memoir from author Trumley Nguyen called The Magic Fish. And this is a story about kind of a boy growing up in an immigrant family who realizes that he's gay. And what I like about this is that through color, the author has three different narratives working on the page or working together at separate times. So the red or pink is his story growing up and feeling more alienated from his family. The yellow is the story of his mother fleeing Vietnam in the 1970s. And the purple are the kind of Vietnamese fairy tales that his mother tells him that kind of help him kind of envision and figure out who he is. So he balances all of those on the same page, on facing pages. So it's like, how can the reader be in a whole bunch of places at once? Is something that comics is really good at doing. And then this is another example. This is A.J. Dungo's In Waves, and this is a graphic memoir of both. It's a history of surfing, and it's a graphic memoir of losing his partner, who is a surfer. So the blue is about the author and his partner, and then the orange is about the history of surfing. So because he's using the history of surfing to bounce off his feelings about what's going on. So this is Joe Sacco's Paying the Land. So this is a graphic history about First Nations activism in Canada. And it looks a lot at the history of residential schools, settler colonialism, and how the First Nations people in Canada have been organizing and basically trying to defend their ways of life. And what I like about this is that this is another panel where you're in a bunch of places at a different time. So in this case, both here in this lower corner, and then the middle tier of strips there, that's somebody who Sacco is talking to right then. He's interviewing them. Their faces are there, but they're surrounded by the history that they're talking about like John MacDonald, Canada's first prime minister, who is trying to basically advocating for Indigenous genocide. It's about residential schools. So he's placing all these people in the context around them that they're talking about. And again, this is every time I look at this, I'm like, that there's so much ink work on that. That is some drawing. And then the last one I'll show you is kind of an experimental narrative from author Richard McGuire called Here. And basically his book is a deep history of one place, which is actually a room in a house. And I think it's actually set in Connecticut, of all places. But he basically through the book, he just juxtaposes different time periods. So here's the room in 1943. In 1986, we zoom forward to that. 1907, there's something going on. 1430, there's a wolf. And the whole book is like this. It's just kind of a juxtaposition of places and times. And so it tells us very fragmented, kind of deep history. So you can see there's a lot of emotional states, taking things that are very simple, complicated, and making them very kind of straightforward, and kind of being able to put kind of juxtapose places and times. These are things that comics are really good at. And are sometimes really hard to do in the actual written form of an academic monograph. All right. So I'm going to talk about my process for the rest of the time. How I actually try to do stuff that's as cool as the things that I have shown you. So I also want to talk about a little bit that when I talk to my comics friends about drawing, and we talk about sources and drawing people and drawing the past, I'm like, but my people who aren't trained historians are like, we can just make people look like whatever we want. I'm like, well, what do the sources say? What do these people what do they actually look like? What does this building look like? And I feel like I approach the history of comics very differently being a trained historian. And there can be a lot of conflict between those things. All right, so I will just start with where I start. Usually when I draw every day, no matter what. Sometimes I draw weird like shapes. Sometimes I'm drawing a squash. Sometimes I'm actually drawing things that turn into comics. So I keep a sketchbook all the time. I always have it with me, and that's where my projects start. So this is actually, I'm glad that Eric mentioned this in our introduction. This is actually the drawings I took when we were at the Nevada test site. So we went on this tour. You couldn't take photographs, but I'm like, I have a sketchbook. So I just drew a bunch of stuff, and as the tour got weirder, I just drew weirder things. So, so we're starting, and it's like great, and then it just gets, oh, here's some prisons for protesters who get on the site. Oh, so that's actually where the origin of that comic. It's just drawing and drawing and drawing. So I draw so much stuff that doesn't make it into a comic, but it's a daily practice that I do pretty much anywhere I go. So sometimes I'll just be randomly drawing, and I'll just come up with something that turns into the comic. So this is actually when I went to the Rocky Flats site when I moved back to Denver. So it's a national wildlife refuge right now. So it's super polluted, but it's great for wildlife, I guess. And I just imagine, like, why doesn't it actually like tell you what's actually going on here? So that's the sketch that ended up leading to the Rocky Flats comic. And this is actually based on an actual map that's there, but it doesn't. There's some like kind of like you shouldn't go here, but it doesn't say why. So I'm just imagining like an honest map is like, nope, death. So so then the next step I usually take is I actually start if something starts to get some traction, I get a lot of ideas, but then when I start like writing them out, I'm like, okay, this isn't that great. Um, but I will start writing things out. So this is actually right after I drew the thing that you just saw. I'm like, well, what would it actually be like to draw, like do something about going to Rocky Flats? So I start sketching it out, start like outlining it. There's a bunch of stuff that didn't actually make it to the end of the comic, and then I start doing a lot of thumbnails. So this is where it actually starts turning into comics. Is like doing little thumbnails of every page, trying to figure out what's the big image, what are the little images, how to pace things like this. Because here's things I never thought about when I'm writing history. How big is my book? Is it this big? Is it this big? Is it this big? Because you have to draw it to size. It has to be a certain proportion. You have to think about what's on this page and what's on this page. Do they go together? Does the audience's eye flow? So I start thinking about thumbnails where I have to decide, is it vertical? Is it horizontal? Is it, you know, I mean, a lot of times the size is actually based on the printing because I self-publish. But that's where it starts coming in comics. And I can actually see this is for a first draft of the Project Plowshare comic. There's still stuff in here that actually is going to make it to the final. So, and then there's some movements that I also draw. Sometimes I actually will like seriously script things. This is a script for a comic about a snake who's having a bad day. I told you I do some cute things, and this is just like I'm just writing out all the text. I'm coming up with like those little brackets are like facing pages, so I know which pages are going together and things like that. And like usually this is the point where I start drawing. Like I have the thumbnails, I have the script, and usually what ends up happening is that like the script ends up becoming a lot shorter when I'm actually drawing and things like that. So I work in an app called Procreate. I do all my work digitally these days. I used to do paper drawings on paper, but now I do almost entirely digital, especially for stuff that I know is going to go to print or to the web. So I usually like start sketching. I sketch out in blue. If you're an old person who like did graphic design, you know that that's for a long time that was what you did like sketches in because it doesn't reproduce. So this is so this is basically used to be called non-photo blue, and so you would draw and like mark and things like on like things that are going to be reproduced. So because it wouldn't be picked up by the printer. So still kind of old school. So do that. then I start doing the actual color, and then at that point it will start going, at that point, the next point is going to editors and then to the printer. But the hardest thing to do is to figure out what goes on the page. I know what I want to say, but every new page is a new composition. And it has to advance the story forward. It has to make sense on its own. It hopefully makes you want to go to the next page. And there's a lot more kind of considerations about composition that I have to do, that I do as a cartoonist than I do just writing anything else. So these are kind of the things that cartoonists have to think about when they're constructing a panel, when they're constructing a page. What moment am I using? Like, comics are basically motion frozen. What am I using? How are they posed? What are they doing? Choice of frame. Is it big up here? Is it little down here? Like if I was writing a comic about this presentation, if I was framing it from behind me, looking at you, that's a very different message. If I'm framing it at somebody in the back looking at me, you know you're seeing something else. If it's framed by somebody looking at their phone, well, there's something going on. So just the framing can tell you a lot that you don't necessarily need to express through words. Choice of image, and that's really kind of something I think a lot about, especially doing history comics. How do I do something that's simple, but still true to the actual story and the actual sources? Choice of word. Am I going to have a lot of text? Am I going to have a little text? And then choice of flow, which is how do things go together? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first couple before we wrap up. So for this Rocky Flats comic, and again, those like if you went to the QR code, you can actually read that one online. Hold on. So again, the actual narrative here is that I went to two different historic sites. I went to the actual site, and then I went to an artist's basically intervention put nearby that tells the real history of Rocky Flats. And I wanted to talk about how I felt at this place and how different these places were. So for framing, I knew I needed to start with big picture. Like, where are we? Where are we in Denver? So here's Rocky Flats. Here's Rocky Mount Arsenal, which is another messed up place. So don't confuse them. Just showing you here's where I live and how close we are to a major metropolitan area. And then when I get there, I want to talk about, you don't see any buildings there. It's actually almost entirely like field with mountains in the background. It's almost like an idyllic Colorado landscape, but it's not. And that's actually when you go in, it says welcome, and there are all these things. So I'm situating myself in place. I'm putting you in the frame of somebody who's just showed up there. What is it going to be like? What am I going to see? And then all you could really do there is walk around, except you can't walk around the really polluted part. But just kind of thinking about like that kind of juxtaposition between the incredible beauty of this place, it's beautiful, and the really, really terrible things that happen there, just kind of putting, again, thinking about this place as like a landscape was really important to how I framed this. And then everyone I know who's gone there thinks about what's under their feet. They're like, how safe is this? What am I walking through? They tell me it's safe, but I don't know what that means exactly. And so I want to talk about framing with the soil. And first, just to kind of emphasize, I'm in a physical place, but that the soil is like, you shouldn't really think that much. I mean, you just want to walk. You don't want to think about what's going to happen if I'm walking here. And then again, I tell the story of these two sites, and I create basically kind of a parallel composition here. So this is kind of the story of the official site. It's like Native people were here, and then came the Cold War. We did a great job. And then we closed it up, and it cleaned it. And now it's safe. But the other site tells something that's like, here's what we actually made here. Like, here's what it actually did to the soil and water. Here's what people did in this protest. Here's like the thing that actually led the FBI and the EPA together to raid the place. That's messed up. And then, we didn't really clean it. And there's all these answers. So by using like a parallel composition and similar framing. This is how I'm kind of juxtaposing. Like, here's how they like we're telling this. This is like the same. It's like the same place, different story. So I'll go through this quickly. Like, I've actually like a couple of people I know who've done like graphic history. Oh, have talked a little bit about images and how they work. So this is just quickly. This is a script for historian Trevor Getz. This is Ibina in the Important Men, which is based off of a court transcript from colonial Africa. He worked with an illustrator, and this is their kind of conversation back and forth. Like, he was like, I want to do that. The illustrator's like, I want to do this. Can you find this source? He's like, no, but here's this source. So he provided all these reference images. The illustrator worked with them, and they worked back and forth to figure things out. Because he's like, I've never thought about like what shape are the trees outside the courthouse. What did the windows look like? What were people wearing on their feet? So the evidence that you need as a cartoonist is often very different than some of the evidence you need as a historian. This is a page from Mark Bennett's Freeman Colby series. He's illustrating a diary of a Civil War soldier. And he, like me, draws like this. So, but on his website, he actually details how he's using his sources. So you have his like very cartoony like style, and then he's like, oh, I use this, and I use this source, and I use this. So it's really good. It's like kind of how can you have this kind of specific style and still work, in a way that is true to kind of like historical sources and thinking like that. So, and then I'll just finish with my current thing and talk to you about some of the things I've had decisions I've had to make. So this is the site of one of the atomic tests that took place in Colorado. This is the site of Project Lewison. So this is the image that I'm working with as reference. And you can see, like, I needed to simplify this very much. So which buildings do I want to put in there? How do I render this complex landscape? How do I, talk about kind of draw the well frame and things like that. But at the same time, I'm also showing what's going on underground. So, I'm just like, so not to scale, but trying to think about like, how do I render historic images, in a way that makes it both like, you realize that this is a place. This is a place that's rooted in time and stuff like this, but it's still kind of like, it's still like it's simple enough to fit the rest. It fits in the style. It fits in kind of the tropes of the comic itself. How do I draw people? If I, it's such a big thing because most of the times I'm drawing people I don't know what they look like. I don't want to guess what they look like. So a lot of them are still alive, I think. I mean, I could go talk to them, but it's like, hey, you gave a testimony in a thing like 45 years ago. Can I talk to you? Is not always, but like, in this case, I actually had an image of Claude Hayward, who's the person whose land this took place on. So he let the AC use it in exchange for like profits, which never happened. And I know what he looks like, but he's not facing the camera. So I'm like, here's what he probably looks like when he's facing a camera. Like, I feel sometimes as a historian, I feel very uncomfortable making these kind of like artistic leaps. Hold on. So, for example, this is actually a panel that, as an artist, I don't love, but I'm talking about kind of like all of the arguments pro and for nuclear testing that were done at public hearings. We have all these people from industry, and then we have these people who are just like, no, this is a bad idea. And I'm like, how do I render this? Like, what do their faces look like? What are the rooms that they're in? I have no idea. But then I was talking to some cartoonist friends that are like, well, it doesn't matter what they look like. What matters is what they're saying. So what if you just emphasize their words? This to me looks so text heavy. I'm not sure if this will go into the final one, but it's like this is the actual key thing you need to know about these historical moments in this comic. So because I'm working with atomic history, a lot of times I'm working with big organizations, big things. And how do you draw bureaucracy? How do you draw the military-industrial complex? How do you draw these things? And one of the things I do like about comics is that I can be kind of snarky. And in this case, for this comic and probably for this one, I just decided to make the AAC logo a character. It's actually the main character in this comic. Um, Look how excited he is about weapons. Look like so excited. And and then these are nuclear warheads. And I actually did a lot of research as to like how did artists of the time in the 50s and the 60s pick nuclear weapons? Like did they use certain tropes? They sure did. That kind of cone shape. That's how people like working in media said this is a nuke. That's what it looks like, even though they don't actually look like this. So, so this is the AC as a character. I'm going to be drawing this guy a lot. So, and this actually took a long time to write. Like, like kind of condense the story of the Cold War into something really short? And then just a few more images. I usually have my comics reviewed by a couple of people. This is the Nevada Test Site comic. I had it reviewed by a friend who's done a lot of work on the Nevada Test Site, a public historian friend who are like give comments. But actually, the best comments come from comics people because they're like, "What is this? What happened?" Because like when you're drawing for like a public audience, you need to know what people who don't know anything about this, how they process this. So they're like, "We did what at this place? I have no idea." So I usually do a have some subject matter experts look at it, and then have just people who are good with comics and who know how to read them and can suggest other things. I usually have some editors. This is actually the editor from Contingent magazine, who is just like looking for all was very good at picking out like inconsistencies. Because that's the thing is once you have like you kind of have an icon that you fixed, you have to keep drawing it the same way. So, and then finally, I also do a lot of self-editing with my my assistant editor, who is disapproving of a whole lot of stuff right now. So anyway, thank you. That's how I draw comics. Again, this will take you to my website where a lot of these comics I've talked about are linked to. I don't have the Project Plowshare one done because it's not done, but it will be up there later. And again, there's all my contact information. And again, after Q&A, I'll be in the back selling copies of some of these, and you can just come up and if you have questions we don't get to. So, all right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cole, for really, really interesting and fun talk. We have time for questions and answers now, so I'll come around with the microphone. And people watching the live stream, you can type your questions into the chat, and we'll be monitoring that as well. Yes.
Thank you very much. That was really, really great, Erin. And I do a lot of work around Hanford, around those issues. So I'm especially interested in what you're doing. I'm a fiction writer.
Oh, okay.
So first I'm curious, I have two questions. One is, what did you write your dissertation on? And have you ever thought about redoing it as a cartoon? And the other thing is, the moment, for instance, where you depict the AC and you have that you've written, we're really into this and other unimportant details. So that word unimportant is such a great word because it's so snarky. Mm-hmm. So are you chuckling when you do that? Are you just, is it just your character that comes out in those moments?
That's a really good question. So for the first question, what's my dissertation on? And like Eric is laughing already. I wrote my dissertation about zoning. So actually on like the history of single family zoning laws in Denver and how that affected two different neighborhoods in the city. One that was kind of going from an all white neighborhood to a racially mixed neighborhood, and another one that is basically becoming kind of the queer neighborhood in Denver. So that's what I did my dissertation on. I thought about doing a comics version of it, but I haven't, and there's reasons for that. And some of the stuff I've talked about, like how how do I draw these people? I mean, I did one where it's where the main character, very similar to the AC character we have, was a single family home, talking about how great it was, and like those apartments over there, you don't want those. You don't want to live in those, and stuff like that. But in the end, I just knew too much about the topic. I was just done. I was just really tired of it. So that's the main reason, is that I've done a few like kind of illustrated things about it, but I'm just done with the topic. So, and the other thing, I mean, I think everyone who does like atomic history develops both a deep sense of empathy in grief and loss, and also kind of this protective layer of snark, because a lot of, especially if you think about like high government officials and all this stuff, a lot of what they're talking about is so ridiculous, and it's so detached from what's actually happening at these sites, what's happening to the bodies of miners, what's happening to the bodies of hibakusha in Japan, what's happening to like indigenous miners in the Southwest. The actual reality is here, but the way the AAC and the government talks about it is so ridiculous. I mean, it's hard not to be, and I'm trying to condense actual statements by the AAC, by different officials and stuff like that, as much as possible. And it's hard to do because there's so much information. They produce an enormous amount of primary sources. So in some ways, you are actually getting my opinion. I mean, this is totally my opinion about all this stuff, but I'm basing it in actual things that the AAC is doing. And I mean, when they did Project Plowshare, they did the testing in Colorado, like nobody was like, what if it's radioactive? What if the gas is radioactive? They're just like, no, this is going to be great. We're going to do all this stuff. And then in the end, they didn't even think that might be the problem, is that it was too radioactive. And you're just like, how? How is that? Anyway, so yes, it's really hard not to be snarky when you have to deal with the AAC. But one of the reasons that I decided to switch more towards like a history of this rather than like, here's how bad this panel is, because it's really easy to be snarky when you're like, this is how it's telling the story and it does it badly. But actually starting with, this is what uranium mining is like. This is what it does to your lungs. And then going to like through the whole story is kind of a more way of like grounding it in place, and also like basically talking about the tragedy of nuclear weapons development and any kind of in uranium mining and all these things. So that's why I'm kind of doing kind of more the big history rather than like, this panel is bad, because they're all bad.
Hi.
Hi.
It's really nice to have you here, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
I have two questions. One is about, the first is your comics have this autobiographical bent as you're presenting it sort of as yourself, as a historian and a professional. Do you think you'd ever write a comic that's more narratively about the historical topic you're talking about, or do you think you will stay with like this self-inserted, like I'm explaining this to you?
Mm-hmm.
And the second is history, when it's written down, you have to make a lot of decisions about what is relevant to the story and what's not. And I imagine that's 100 times harder when you're actually drawing all these panels, because you could be like, oh, I want to include this because it's really relevant, but now I have to draw like buildings. Or
yeah, or like, I don't know how to draw that.
I hate drawing buildings. Mm-hmm. But so how does your usual decision making process, like when you're writing a history, how do you do it that way? And then the added layer of comics, mm-hmm. How do you make that additional decision?
Mm-hmm. Those are good questions. So the comics tradition that I kind of come out of is inherently autobiographical. So to me, like, a lot of comics are not autobiographical, but there's always an element of yourself in them. Like, whether, again, how you're depicting yourself or things like that. So I'm very used to comics being an autobiographical genre. So, because those are a lot of the comics I grew up reading in the 90s. A lot of the people who are kind of in that tranche of comics, because again, comics is a huge field. I really only work in one kind of narrow slice of that. Drawing about yourself is expected. And that's very different than the historical training I got. Although, like, I went through a program where, like, my advisor, Eric and I's shared advisor, was very much about narrative and like telling the story. And it's okay to stick yourself in there every once in a while, just as long as you're actually very, you're doing it in a way that advances the story that is necessary to the narrative that you're telling. So for this project I'm going to do, it will be a little less autobiographical. Like in the things from Plowshare that you are seeing, it kind of goes back and forth between past and present. I didn't really show any of the present ones. Like I'm visiting the site with my dad because we want to go see it, and then here's what it's actually like, and then it's so different from the actual history of the site, which is kind of chaotic and weird and so like this. They're again like these very peaceful places, but it's less about me. I mean, that's more of a framing device than it's about like me. So the actual story is the history of Project Plowshare. But since this topic is so wrapped up in my family history and being from Western Colorado, it's inherently going to have some memoir aspects. And that's one of the reasons it's being very limited to Colorado. So the other one is just to actually give it a limiter. So you're not doing the entire Atomic West. Also, all the sources are within driving distance of me. That's also really important. Is that there's enough there that's where I have to go out and like get a bunch of other perspectives and stuff like that. But it's still really about this is what happened to this place. That's really important to me. So I haven't figured out how to balance those things. So, and then about how do you figure out what to put on the page? So that's the thumbnailing process that I outlined. A lot of the thumbnailing process is like, what is the minimum viable page for this panel? Like, what's the thing that's really going to get people's attention? What's going to make people's eyes flow down the page? And usually that's where I start. You start with the thumbnail. Think about, one of the things that's really good about having worked in museums is that when I write exhibit panels, I have 100 words, maybe. Mostly I have 50 words or 75 words. How do I take this thing that's really complex and condense it to that for somebody who's probably going to look at it for 3 seconds and then go to the bathroom? So museums have actually really helped me be able to figure out like what's the things that really help build up the story I want to tell. Like in the panel I showed you about kind of the site, like I'm like, am I adding more details because I think that's what a real artist does? Or adding more details because this helps the reader actually understand this further? That's a really hard balance. Because sometimes I'm like, well, I need to make this look like this. And then that's kind of, trying to figure out that internal voice versus like, people need to know that it's here and it's in this place. But you don't necessarily have to know that there's a truck here and there's, anyway. So it's kind of like figuring out what I want each page to say and building up from there, but not listening to my voice where like a real artist would put a whole lot of cross-hatching in that. So.
Thank you for the talk. And a lot of the students who came from my class, photographers or filmmakers. And so talking about the process and the angle, all that also applies to their medium, but also combining content with framing is so important for them to think about. My question is, what would you like to say to your art professor, or what should your art professor have told you?
I mean, I'll be honest, this happened in a drawing class where he was trying to get a bunch of people who love lines to work with shade and shapes and so I actually kind of figured out how to do, but I think, I don't know, even though I have most of an art degree, I know a lot of people who work in this field who have no art training. They just decided they had a story to tell and they wanted to tell it, and they developed themselves through talking to other cartoonists or, going to shows and things like that. I think I would say, there's one thing to encourage people to try a different style so that they can kind of find their voice, and another thing to be like, it just has too many lines. So, because I was always pretty like I like art because I like drawing comics, and I'm not necessarily going to become a like fine artist. So I think I would actually tell this my sort of like, well, guess what? It actually worked out fine. Um, I don't draw with charcoal, so I don't need to shade too much. But that in the end, like people come in with their strengths and their weaknesses, and it's your job to kind of develop the strengths while also encouraging people to branch out. So
Just a quick question, and I'm the drawing professor, and I some of my students are still here, and I handed them a Sharpie marker today and said stop shading. So today was definitely all about the line. My question and my I'm thinking of a way to get you back to Rhode Island.
oh no,
In this way is that one town over in Charlestown there was a uranium laundromat.
ooh,
And
why didn't you tell me about this?
I didn't know about it.
it is the only documented case of a death by radiation exposure
Wow,
right in Charlestown, Rhode Island, in Hope Valley. And what's fascinating about this is that many people don't know about it. The building, the uranium cleaning facility, it has been razed. There's nothing left, and there's only a foundation. And that local man who died, he died within 48 hours of the radiation exposure. And on his trip to the hospital, he left like a Bart Simpson green trail of uranium in his wake. And there were many people who got sick treating him. And so, if you're interested,
I'm definitely interested in that.
there's a massive disaster that happened just like 10 miles down the road.
Wow.
So
Guess what we're doing?
I'll give you a link actually when you're done. If
Okay,
you want to look at
that
it.
would be great.
We're going to take a couple questions from the live stream now.
David Raphael says, I was told that you have to be good at drawing everything to be a good graphic novelist. This is incredibly intimidating and a little discouraging. What can I do to be more confident in my abilities?
Just do it. I mean, really, like I use shortcuts when they make sense. I mean, I'll be honest. Sometimes I will trace buildings and stuff like that because it's just like it's kind of background information. It's just there to kind of set the stage. But honestly, just draw things. I know so many I know so many people who think they're terrible artists, but they do just fine because it's about communicating. It's about this is the story I want to tell, and sometimes simple is better. Sometimes crappy quote unquote crappy drawings tell a story better than something like I actually just read, and I was going to put a comic image of it here. Like there's a new, well, it came out in 2020. It's like a French graphic novel about the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb, and it's beautifully drawn. I mean, whoever did it is extremely skilled and used a lot of reference images, and it's so flat at the same time. It's just so glossy, and it doesn't really convey a lot, but it's really, really pretty. And at the same time, there's a book that just came out called Nuking Alaska, which is about Project Glacier in Alaska, and it's done by this former newspaper cartoonist, and he's, working really quick, and he's working digitally, but it conveys the emotional, like, heaviness of basically being kind of like a guinea pig for, America's, like, nuclear adventures. So isn't as pretty as the other one, but it does a much better job conveying the actual, like, information the author wants you to convey. So just draw.
There's one more. Altmar says, obviously the most famous comic history is that one book about the mice.
Yes.
Does that work cast a shadow that affects how you think or work?
So he's talking about Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is, again, for a lot of people, was one of the first, kind of works coming out of kind of alternative cartooning that kind of exposed people to the process of how comics should tell history. So basically, it's Art Spiegelman talking about his father's experience in the Holocaust, and it made a huge splash in cartooning, and it spawned its own book called Meta Mouse, which is all about the writing of Mouse. And then, as you know, like it's there's a lot of book bans going on in red states of the country, in like school districts. Mouse has been on the list a lot, and along with a lot of other graphic novels and histories. So, and it's really some like a work that's that important, iconic, and important in the field. Obviously, overshadows you, but you also are like most people I know. They're like, I can never do that. That's its own thing. It stands apart. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to work like that. I think it's more important for readers than it is for a lot of artists. Like it still gets taught a lot in schools. Like when people talk to me about assigning graphic histories, they always start with like Mouse or Persepolis, which is very such, or a couple of other things. And I'm just like, there's a lot more that's new and out there you can assign inside instead. So I think for readers, it's still kind of this, but I think a lot of artists themselves really admire it, but they've kind of moved on. They you know, there's just been a lot of work since then. So
I think we have time for one more question. I think I saw a hand up in the front row.
Are you familiar with Raymond Briggs, who did the Snowman?
Mhm.
And then he did the history of London and the bombing
Yep.
of London, and that was his magnum opus.
Mm-hmm.
It just, he had the illustration, but how he said it and how it was personal.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't sound like
Yep.
the Snowman, but I remember bringing it home and just saying, this is personal and it tells the whole history of what London went through.
Mm-hmm.
It was personal.
I haven't. I know of that book. I haven't read it, so but I will definitely check it out. But yeah, like it's sometimes those really personal ones are like really important, but they don't sell as well.
Oh yeah, so you have to find those ones that
Uh-huh.
didn't make money.
Well, that's easy because almost no comics make money. So, but I know what you mean. So
Well, thank you all for your questions and Dr. Cole for a wonderful presentation.
thank you so much for having me.
I hope you'll stick around for coffee, cookies, and comics. And please consider joining us in mid-October for our next two events. On October 11th, we have a panel on telling stories about the ocean, and October 15th, a panel and concert on music and storytelling on Broadway. We hope to see some of you there.